everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Radio comes to Grays Harbor. Hello there. How's your radio working these days? Did you hear the United Nations program this evening over this station? It comes direct from Lake Success and brings the voices of some of the most important events of our times right into your home. Maybe you've heard the news commentator from Washington, D.C. a few minutes ago. And if we weren't about to bring you a play-by-play description of the Aberdeen High School football game, we'd be feeding you the game between Oklahoma A&M and Drake University that's coming over our network lines right now. No, it's not particularly remarkable that the little knob there in the main control room that limits the Liberty Network line should be a control of entertainment all over the world. Radio has gotten beyond the stage where it was remarkable. In fact, it's become pretty commonplace. But there was a time on Grays Harbor when radio was pretty much a mystery. People would travel for a mile to listen to a radio and tell about it afterwards the way we describe a trip to the moon someday. And tonight, we're going to open the scrapbook to the story of radio in our hometown. It's a very long story, with a lot of good laughs and one that reaches back more than 30 years. Of course, the first manifestation of this electrical age in the way of high-powered communication was the Coast Guard wireless station at Westport. But that doesn't really count in radio. It was a maze of dots and dashes and scattered from Westport sandspits to all parts of the earth. And it was front page news the first time the operator at the station contacted Honolulu on the equipment. That was way back in the din years of the first decade of the century. But it wasn't radio, not radio as we know it, or rather the grandfather of the radio that we know it, came around to Grays Harbor in the years just following the First World War. It was an offspring of the wireless and the toy of young fellows who liked to hook wires together and watch the sparks, or see the colored glow of tubes. There were a lot of them back there in the early years, and they made a game of it. They conferred with each other and they built their little radio receivers, discussing the best points of their hookups and equipment. Then they competed with each other to see who could hear the most stations, or the most remote stations. Finally, they began to build sending equipment, and the game began to take on a luster. Chris Magan built 10 Water and was licensed by the Federal Communications Commission as Station 7. He held some records for distance around the harbor. He had heard from 3,000 to 8,000 miles away. Station 7 SH was Alex Homlick, who had talked with Hawaii and New Zealand with his 10-watt equipment. Out of Junction City, young Arnold West had a 10-watt transmitter that had been heard in Alaska, Mexico, and Hawaii. Arnie's station was 7LH. The powerful station on the harbor was Ernie McGee's over in Hoquiam. Ernie was 7NN, and with his 100-watt, he had talked with radio fans down in Australia without the least bit of difficulty. Up in Montesano, Henry Olszewski had gone in for talking with radio amateurs in various states, and in 1921 he had made contact with at least one in every of the 48 states. Tommy Erdman of Hoquiam was another. There was a light-knit fraternity of wireless bugs who talked a strange lingo and put towering poles on top of their homes to confound the public. Oh yes, they had a central meeting place. It was downtown Aberdeen. That is almost downtown, It was on Wishkah Street, right where Tom Brick now operates his drugstore. But Wishkah Street still retains some of its residential atmosphere, with houses filling the lots from H West. The Wishkah meeting place was the electrical shop of the Aberdeen man named Frank Cooper. Frank had been in the war and had been an electrician and had come back with some ideas about electronics that he wanted to prove. He had rigged a monstrous coil that threw a lightning-like spark, and standing on an insulated spool, he would pick off the chain lightning with a brass rod and make it perform tricks through his fingers. Also, Frank puttered with wireless receiving sets, and because his shop was conveniently located, the wireless boys of the early 1920s convened around his hot stove to talk tubes and oscillators, their latest models of rotary gap, and heterodyne hookups. Two of these lads were young Rennie Hetley and young Walter Hemrick. Walter was the son of the town's brewmaster who had given up the brewing business when the state went dry. He not only had a devouring interest in electronics. Walt was a doer. Rennie was a high school boy who said on his own that he used to talk with distant points. But they weren't satisfied to stop there. They had heard that radio, audio they called it, was coming in, and they wanted to do something about it. In fact, they had the great desire to own one of those new audio stations in the late 1921s. Walter Hemrick applied for the license to construct a radio station in Aberdeen, and the Federal Commission of Communication, then a modest and early approach institution of government, granted the license and call letters KNT. Aberdeen had its first radio station. Grays Harbor would hear the mysteries of radio for the first time. Hemrick and Hetley in as partners. He needed someone to help keep the phonograph wound, and together they set up their station in the back room of Stanley Smith's hardware store on the corner of Wishkah and G Streets. KNT was a simple operation. There was a transmitter, some speech input equipment, and a microphone. Phonograph records were played on an Edison phonograph of the era with a microphone placed in front of the speaker. And throughout the harbor, amateur radio fans who had built themselves radio sets followed the directions in the Popular Mechanics or American Boys magazines and listened each evening from 6 to 7:30 when the station was on the air. At Frank Cooper's shop, a high-powered receiver with a big horn for a speaker blared the music out over the corner of Market and Broadway, and Grays Harbor people asked each other if they had heard the new radio. Of course, very few had, because there were very few radio sets. But those who had said that it would never take a place of the good gramophone. Too noisy, they told each other. Now, this was long before the owners of the radio station KDKA in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, had discovered that radio was one of the most potent mediums in advertising ever discovered, and radio was a toy and a toy only. It was no visible means of support. In fact, except for the angels who carried the station on their backs, it had no means of support, and after a few months of playing with their radio station, Hetley and Hemrick tired of it, and it was sold, very reasonably indeed, to Elwood Griggs, who took up the chore of winding the phonograph and changing the records for the slowly growing audience that listened and noted the station's call letters. But Briggs, too, tired of his toy, and the station KNT went out of existence. Grays Harbor had seen radio come and go, and that was that. But in the larger cities of the coast, radio, which had started in the same amateur way, hung on and continued to grow. And in 1924, A.C. Murray, an active member of the Kiwanis Club, proposed at a luncheon club that they start a radio station to advertise Grays Harbor. H.C. Hancock was appointed chairman of the committee and investigated the problems of installing a radio station in Aberdeen. It was about this time that the local newspaper began to print the schedules of the radio station in Seattle, Tacoma, Portland, and San Francisco. The newspaper had not yet discovered that the radio was to be its greatest competitor, and the days of the newspaper as a monopolizing influence in advertising was over. In fact, those were the high points in those years of the newspaper. They would never be so again, and they would never again have things so easy. The downgrade was beginning. In the tiny voice of the new medium that newspaper treated as a great new novelty. It was about this time that Charles Kane, who ran the radio shop in the brand new Morrick Hotel, predicted that someday the President of the United States would use the radio to talk to the nation. People throughout he might, but it hardly seemed likely. And through 1925 and 1926, the residents of Grays Harbor stopped and squinted into the dials of the radio sets, trying to find the entertainment feature sandwiched between the squeals and howls of the crude receivers. And then, in 1927, the names of Alfred M. Hubbard and Earl Corwin appeared in the news. They were Seattle men who had seen the start of the radio industry, and they had seen the idea of using radio as an advertising medium catch on. They had seen Seattle merchants experiment with the new medium and watched them mobbed by radio listeners who heard their ads. They had seen the toy, the novelty that couldn't seem to find a place, finally land on both feet as it was discovered as a place in the scheme of things. They wanted to start a radio station in Aberdeen. In January of 1927, they granted a license, and through negotiations with Jones and Drones, the firm that owned the Finch Building, they arranged for studios. They picked the Finch Building because it was the highest building in town except for the new Beaker Building, and that was out of their reach. And they planned to put the antenna on top of the building. Aberdeen's newspaper blasted the good news. Grays Harbor is to have a radio station. The powerful 500-watt station is to rise on the Finch Building. It will broadcast on 210 meters. The story described the construction of the studios with their special sound treatments and elaborate equipment that would be shipped to the harbor. It named the staff. Earl Corwin was to be the business manager and announcer. Al Hubbard, the engineer. A young Aberdeen boy, Stanley Spiegel, was to be the program director, and the operator was to be Rennie Hetley, who had once owned the harbor's first radio station. The station would open on January 13th with a special program, and it did. Grays Harbor crowded around its radio sets that night to catch the first words from the new station. Prizes had been offered to the first ones to call long distance to telegraph the station of the reception, and for the telegram from the farthest point. Hundreds of telegrams showered the station that night during the 2-hour broadcast. Frank Lamb made the inaugural speech, and Manager Corwin announced that the station would specialize in football, prize fights, lectures, sermons, and organ recitals. It would soon be on the coast-wise hookup. Dr. F.C. Wyatt announced that he was forming a radio club for Grays Harbor listeners. It was a big night for Grays Harbor. At 10 o'clock, the station went off and did not return to the air for 10 days. Equipment trouble was given for the reason, but radio had arrived in Grays Harbor. 2 weeks later, when the station was back on the air, Louis Fred, Charlotte Ogden, Arvo Rankin gave a recital. There were the pupils of Mrs. John Tenwick and Carl Muldren, just like having them in the room, people told each other. Well, the first station had its ups and downs. It was on and off. It was new and unfamiliar. There were few radio receivers, and technicians were strange to the management. And finally, its owners gave up. Others took over in a period of transition and saw several owners in the months that followed. But through its trying period, radio was proving itself to be a necessity. It was striking. Yes, it's old stuff to listeners now to hear the important news of the world, the great sports events, the musical features, and if they're not delivered with precision, both on time and quality, the audience considers itself poor operations. and rightly so, for radio has long since come of age. But back in the early 1920s, it was a scrawny infant that gave promise of something, but no one knew quite what. It took 30 years to write the story of radio that we find tonight here in our Hometown Scrapbook. Thanks for listening.